Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If you want it, come and get some. Because we love wisdom. Because we love wisdom.
People in every part of the globe are perishing because their judgment is low. From children to teens to elderly folks, this epidemic is incredibly bold. Wisdom is needed to see through the fog. Without it, we'll stumble and cease to the law. You're jumping without something to break and fall if you choose to ignore wisdom's beckoning call. The only people who will lose the war are those who don't know who they're fighting for. You are the only one who can decide your fate. Don't waste your life when you can live inside of grace. If we turn to God and behold His shining face, we will gain traction to run in this human race.
Hey, what's going on? JC Johnson here, and you are listening to For the Love of Wisdom, where philosophy meets the streets. And on today's episode, we are discussing the wisdom of hedonism.
Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If you want it, come and get some. Because we love wisdom. Because we love wisdom. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If you want it, come and get some. Because we love wisdom. Because we love wisdom.
There are a lot of people who may not understand why we're doing a show about hedonism, or what kind of positive impact that could have. And for some people, you say, well, what is hedonism anyway? I don't even know what that is. So depending on what your background is like, what you've been exposed to, this I think is a really important topic. And depending on your perspective, that's really going to determine how you look at it. So we're going to spend some time going over that today. I think that you're going to enjoy it. Going to go into it in just a couple minutes. But first, just wanted to remind you, just in case you missed the show last time, or if you've never listened to the show before, this is what the show is all about. This is really a show about philosophy, right? It's a show on philosophy, and it's philosophy, but philosophy with a twist. So basically, what we're doing is we're looking at different topics each week. The first season, last year, every episode ended with the same suffix. It ended with an ity. So like we had, the wisdom of eternity, the wisdom of paternity, the wisdom of finality. We had the wisdom of integrity, all these different ity words, right? But now we're in the second season of the show, and for the next, almost 40 episodes now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to look at words that end with ism. Okay, so the last time that we met, we discussed something that I think was really important, a really important topic. We discussed the wisdom of pragmatism. And just like hedonism, sometimes pragmatism, depending on how you look at it, could be seen as a positive thing or a negative thing. And one thing that I like to do, I don't like to assume that anyone has any particular thoughts about any of these topics. So I try to present it in as open a way as possible without being subjective, because, I have my own opinion about a lot of these things, but I really try not to be guided by my own opinion. I really try to do research and present something that's going to be as objective as possible. I don't think that there's no profit in trying to persuade someone of something just because that's how I feel. I would rather go by the facts. I think the facts are what are most important. And on this show, that's what we're hoping to discover. We're hoping to discover what the facts are about these different topics. And so we looked at pragmatism. Pragmatism is a philosophical approach, and it means more than a willingness to compromise, but it calls for a distinctive way of understanding truth that begins with examining what practical difference ideas or beliefs make. So it's a pretty interesting topic. I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. And if you missed that episode, don't worry, it is going to be coming soon. for you to listen to as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, anywhere where podcasts can be heard. And we're in the second season now, and we are getting ready to actually, for the next 12 days, for the remainder of the month of January, we're actually going to be uploading a new podcast every day until the end of the month. So definitely check that out, because you'll be able to hear past episodes such as this one from last time on pragmatism. You got episodes on professionalism, indigenism, a bunch of really interesting shows. So definitely check that out for the month of January. You can hear each of those. You can either go online again, like I said, to places like iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, Spotify. You can go to any of those kind of places. If you have an Alexa enabled device, you can just say, Alexa, play For the Love of Wisdom, and it'll show up for you right there on your Echo or any other kind of Alexa enabled device. And then you can also check it out on my website as well. There's links to all of the podcasts there. Just go to www.oneplanmedia.com. All right, so One Plan Media LLC, that is the company that produces these podcasts that you're listening to. So definitely check that out, oneplanmedia.com. And you can also follow me on Instagram. The handle is at oneplanmedia. All right, and that's one spelled out, O-N-E. People always ask, is it the number one or the word one? So that can be a little confusing, but yeah, one, O-N-E, Plan Media. All right, so today we're discussing hedonism, and this is something that I definitely want to sort of tread lightly with, because it can have a negative connotation. I like to look at words that people may consider negative at times, because I think that there's always something good that we can take out of everything, and things are not so black and white. So hedonism, interesting topic, and there's some people that I think have a really interesting perspective on this, and I want to share that with you definitely when we come back, so that we can really dive into this topic properly and look at it from all sides, right? We're going to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, just so that we can get to the bottom of this thing. But right now, since we are in the second season of the show, you may have noticed from the last season, some things are different. The music is a little bit different. Just the approach to certain things is different, but ultimately it's the same thing. And if you're new to the show, this show is a show on philosophy, and the word philosophy is actually the reason for the show title, The Love of Wisdom, For the Love of Wisdom. And you may say, well, what does that have to do with that? Well, the original meaning of the word philosophy comes from the Greek roots philo, which means love, and sophos or Sophia. That word means wisdom. And when you put the two words together, you get love of wisdom. And that's where they got the English word philosophy from. It actually comes from those root words there. So just a little bit of history for you. And, wisdom is the ability to discern. It's the ability to be able to understand, relationships, to have insight into them. It's the ability to have good sense or judgment, and not judgment in the sense of judging somebody like prejudging, being prejudiced. That's a whole different thing. People say, oh, you can't judge. Well, there's nothing wrong with judging. There is something wrong with prejudging or being prejudiced, but there's nothing wrong with making a judgment. Basically, looking at something with all the evidence, with all the facts, and being able to make a decision about it. That's wise, right? Because if you didn't use judgment, then people would do all types of crazy things, like jump off cliffs, or walk into potholes, or run into walls, right? We don't do that kind of stuff because we make a judgment. We make a judgment to say that's not a good idea. But more on that after this. You're listening on North Coast Underground, where the underground starts with you. All right, welcome back. You're listening to For the Love of Wisdom, where philosophy meets the streets, on North Coast Underground, where the underground starts with you. And on today's show, we're discussing the wisdom of hedonism, right? Hedonism, it definitely is a word that sometimes can rub people the wrong way, and for others it's a dream come true, right? So it just really depends on who you are, where you come from. Before the break, we were just discussing how hedonism is something that can go either way, right? There's not just one way to look at it. There's a couple different ways to look at it. It can be something either positive or negative. And one thing that we saw here, just from taking a look at Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it said that hedonism, one, is the doctrine that pleasure or happiness is the sole or chief end or good in someone's life. And it says that when hedonism first appeared in English in the middle of the 19th century, it referred to the doctrines of certain schools of philosophy in ancient Greece, who held that happiness or pleasure constituted the chief goal in life. As used today, the word frequently carries a judgmental tinge. And so it goes on to say that if someone is described as living a life of hedonism, the implication is that he or she derives happiness from debauchery rather than, say, spending quality time with family or forming meaningful relationships at work. Hedonism comes from the Greek, which also provides the root of the word anhedonia, which is a psychological condition characterized by inability to experience pleasure in normally pleasurable acts. Now that is really interesting to me, that somebody could have that kind of disorder where they don't receive pleasure from things that everyone else receives pleasure from. Everyone else is excited about eating ice cream or going to an amusement park and riding a roller coaster or going on their first date or whatever, but these people feel nothing. They don't experience anything. So that is that kind of situation there. And as I mentioned before the break, you have people in this life who experience pleasure in ways that other people don't experience pleasure, right? You have people like Jeffrey Dahmer, and Jeffrey Dahmer was someone who was known to be a cannibal. He was known to actually invite usually young men over to his house, and they thought that they were coming for one thing. Well, what ended up happening is that he would poison them. He would end up receiving pleasure from them, being intimate with them maybe after they were dead. He would cut them up, he would eat them, he would store the remains in his house so he could eat it later. This is not a normal person, right? This is somebody that received pleasure in ways that hopefully you or anyone else doesn't, right? And if that's something you do, then you definitely want to stop. That's not cool, right? So there are definitely people out there who receive pleasure in ways that other people don't, or people who don't receive pleasure in ways that most people do. But for the most part, pleasure is a really important thing. It's an important part of everyone's life, whether they want to admit it or not. Emotions such as joy, happiness, even emotions like pain, discomfort. This is all for a reason. We all experience these things. And when we talk about hedonism, I guess the important thing to look at is why do you have this desire, right? It's not necessarily bad to want to experience extreme pleasure, like it said in the example from Webster's dictionary, that somebody can receive happiness from spending quality time with their family or forming meaningful relationships at work. These are legitimate reasons to be happy about something and to receive pleasure. There's nothing wrong with that. So one thing I want to take a look at the book of Ecclesiastes, because I think that this is pretty good. It pretty much breaks down this whole idea of people who live for pleasure's sake. Ecclesiastes 2 verses 1 through 11. And I'm reading here from the easy to read version. And this is not a literal translation of the Bible. It's more of a paraphrase, but it's a good paraphrase. And I think that it really helps to bring certain passages home and makes it really stand out the way it's supposed to here in the 21st century. And what it says here, it has a subtitle. It has actually two subtitles within this passage. The first subtitle is, Does Having Fun Bring Happiness? Okay, so the writer here is saying, I said to myself, I should have fun. I should enjoy everything as much as I can. But I learned that this is also useless. It is foolish to laugh all the time. Having fun does not do any good. So I decided to fill my body with wine while I filled my mind with wisdom. I tried this foolishness because I wanted to find a way to be happy. I wanted to see what was good for people to do during their during their few days of life, right? So what is he saying here? He's saying basically that he thought that getting drunk was going to make him happy. He's not talking about having a little sip, maybe a small glass of wine. He's talking about really, getting into some bottles here. And he said that, I thought that this would make me happy because it seems to make other people happy. So he said, before that, he said, I should have fun. I should enjoy everything as much as I can. But in the end, though, ultimately what he's saying here is that pleasure for pleasure's sake, it really isn't fun. It's really not worth it. Then he goes on to say here, does hard work bring happiness? This is the next question. This is the next subtitle. Does hard work bring happiness? So at first he said, well, maybe having fun brings happiness. But he said, no, that doesn't work. Getting drunk doesn't work. That doesn't bring me happiness. And if you've ever been drunk before, you know that maybe initially it might make you feel good for a while, but you'll feel horrible the next day, especially if you have a hangover and you're throwing up everywhere and you can't go to work, or maybe you had something fun planned, but you can't even do that anymore because you're so sick. There's nothing cool about that, and anyone who has experienced that will know. But what he's saying here is he thought that would make him happy, and what he found out is that sadly that was not possible. That was not something that could make him happy. That was something that probably only made him feel worse, because alcohol actually is a depressant. So if you drink just a little bit of it, you probably will feel good for a while, but when you overindulge, when you drink too much, it can make you feel depressed. It can really bring you down. It can make you it can cause you to make horrible decisions. This is why there's so many drunk driving car accidents, because when you drink too much, your judgment is impaired. And people drink because they're looking for pleasure, but this kind of pleasure doesn't really lead to anything worthwhile. More on that, though, after this. You're listening to North Coast Underground, where the underground starts with you. Hey, what's going on? JC Johnson here, and I'm back. You're listening to For the Love of Wisdom, where philosophy meets the streets. And on today's show, we're actually discussing hedonism, right? This is a really interesting topic to me, I think, because it is something that I think can be taken either way. It can be looked at as something good, or it can be looked at as something extremely bad, depending on what kind of understanding or background you have. So right now we're looking at the book of Ecclesiastes, and here the writer is talking about things that he's done in his life that he thought were going to bring him happiness, right? So one thing that he says is, I decided to fill my body with wine while I filled my mind with wisdom. I tried this foolishness because I wanted to find a way to be happy. He calls it foolishness, right? He basically said, I thought that this was something cool, but it really didn't make me happy. He said, I wanted to see what was good for people to do during their few days of life. This sounds to me like somebody who's bored, right? It's kind of like the writer of Ecclesiastes is said to be King Solomon, and he was known at the time as the wisest man in the world and also one of the wealthiest men in the world. So someone who's super wealthy, one of the dangers they can find themselves in is having way too much free time on their hands. So he has all this free time. So he said, I'm just going to try to do something with it. Even though he was a king, and I'm sure he had plenty of responsibilities, stuff to keep him busy, he also had enough money to be able to take extended vacations if he wanted to. So that's one of the dangers of having too much. You might say, well, I wish I had billions of dollars, right? But who knows? You may not be able to handle it if you had it. So that's definitely one of those things. I mean, there's nothing wrong with, wanting to be successful or have a lot of money, but you got to know what you're getting yourself into. When you have money, it opens up good doors for you, like opportunities to do great things, but it also opens up doors for you to do anything that your mind, if in the gutter, could take you to. And it may not always be a good idea to go down those paths. It's really important that, if you do have access to a large amount of money, that you have self-control and you have some accountability, some people in your life to help keep you grounded and remind you that who you are is more important than how much you have, right? How you conduct yourself is more important than how many transactions you're able to conduct, right? But anyway, the writer here of Ecclesiastes, he goes on to say, I also gathered silver and gold for myself. Before that, he says, I began doing great things. I built houses and I planted vineyards for myself. I planted gardens and I made parks. I planted all kinds of fruit trees. I made pools of water for myself, and I used them to water my growing trees. I bought men and women slaves, and there were slaves born in my house. I owned many great things. I had herds of cattle and flocks of sheep. I owned more things than any other person in Jerusalem did. I also gathered silver and gold for myself. I took treasures from kings and their nations. I had men and women singing for me. I had everything any man could want. So he's basically saying, look, I had it all. Just imagine this, right? Imagine you wake up in the morning and, the curtains are pulled back, the sun is shining, and you have 5 people who are paid to welcome you and tell you good morning by singing you your very own song, right? I mean, this dude had it all. He said, I became very rich and famous. I was greater than anyone who lived in Jerusalem before me. My wisdom was always there to help me. Anything my eyes saw and wanted, I got for myself. My mind was pleased with everything I did, and this happiness was the reward for all my hard work. So, before he was saying, he was just looking for something to get into, right? He needed something to pass the time. That's why he said he got into, drinking wine heavily, because he said he needed something to do. He had so much money that, he just didn't know what to do with himself. But here's what he goes on to say at the end of this passage, right? So after all that, after he tells us about how much stuff he's been able to do, about all the great things he's been able to get for himself, he says, but then I looked at everything that I had done and the wealth that I had gained. I decided it was all a waste of time. It was like trying to catch the wind, right? There is nothing to gain from anything that we do in this life. And that was his conclusion there. And he gives this illustration. I think it's a really good one. He talks about grasping at the wind. Imagine trying to get a fistful of the wind. it's impossible, right? It's something that you can't do because, I mean, the wind is just, it does its own thing. You know, it can't be captured by you. Even if you try to bottle it up in a jar, it just doesn't work, right? So he was saying that this is something that he thought he could do to make him happy. But in the end, he found that seeking after pleasure for pleasure's sake alone is not good enough. It's not something good to, you know, try to live your life only to make yourself feel good. There's actually so much more that's important in life. Your friends, your family, ideas God has given you, all that is more important. But more on that after this. We're getting ready to take a quick break. We're going to play some music, but we'll be right back. You are listening to North Coast Underground, where the underground starts with you.
Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If you want it, come and get some. Because we love wisdom. Because we love wisdom. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom.